There is a franchise that has survived 4 decades, multiple tonal U-turns, a cabin in the woods, a department store parking garage, and an absolute avalanche of fake blood. It has been terrifying, then slapstick comedy, then medieval adventure, then back to terrifying again. And every single time someone tries to write it off, it comes back harder, louder, and considerably more drenched in gore. That franchise is Evil Dead. And now, with Evil Dead Burn dropping in theaters on July 10, 2026, the series is about to do something it has never done before in 45 years of existence. It is making a full-blown action horror film. Car chases, rooftop fights, martial arts choreography, Deadites running up bathroom ceilings. The question is not whether that sounds wild, the question is whether it can actually work, because the history of action horror is, to put it gently, not a pretty picture. Stick with me, we need to go back to where this all started. It is 1981. A young filmmaker from Michigan named Sam Raimi takes a 29-year-old script, a crew of his college friends, and a budget of roughly $375,000 and heads into the woods of Tennessee. What came out of that experience was The Evil Dead. Now, The Evil Dead was not supposed to be fun. It was never marketed as entertainment in the comfortable sense of the word. It was grim, relentless, and very specifically designed to make you feel trapped. 5 college students, a remote cabin, an ancient book called the Necronomicon, and a tape recording that reads the book's passages out loud like someone who fundamentally does not understand the concept of consequences. The film was called a video nasty in the UK. It was banned in several countries. Critics alternated between being horrified and being bizarrely impressed by how much Raimi achieved with almost no money. The camera work was genuinely inventive. The practical effects made by a team with basically zero budget were unsettling in ways that expensive modern CGI simply cannot replicate. It was, by any reasonable measure, a serious piece of horror filmmaking, and then 1987 happened. Evil Dead 2 arrived, and Sam Raimi apparently decided that the appropriate follow-up to a psychologically disturbing horror film was to turn the whole thing into a cartoon, not metaphorically. The film is genuinely structured like a Looney Tunes short, except with eyeballs popping out of faces and possessed hands attacking their owners. The tonal whiplash was extreme. Where the first film owed a debt to classic supernatural horror, Evil Dead 2 was drawing from Tex Avery animated shorts and vaudeville physical comedy. The horror was still there in isolated moments, but the dominant energy was gleeful, absurdist, and fundamentally not scared of itself. Bruce Campbell's performance as Ash Williams became iconic specifically because of this shift. He was no longer a victim. He was a bumbling, involuntary action hero fighting his own hand in a kitchen. It was genuinely strange filmmaking, and audiences and critics responded warmly to it, even if nobody quite knew what to make of it. Then Army of Darkness in 1992 pushed even further. The Deadites followed Ash back to medieval England. It became an adventure film, a comedic one. Some people compared it to Indiana Jones. Others pointed toward the Brendan Fraser mummy movies before those even existed. Either way, the horror was largely ornamental at that point. The franchise then went dormant for over 2 decades. When Fede Alvarez arrived with the 2013 reboot, simply titled Evil Dead, he did something almost counterintuitive. He stripped everything back. No comedy, no slapstick, no winking at the audience. Just a brutally bleak, deliberately punishing horror film about college students being destroyed one by one in that same remote cabin setting. Critics called it one of the most intense horror films in years. Audiences who were expecting something closer to Army of Darkness were caught off guard, but as a straight horror film, it worked. It was committed to its tone in a way that earned respect. Then 2023 brought Evil Dead Rise. Lee Cronin, an Irish director who had made the quietly effective horror film The Hole in the Ground, was handpicked by Sam Raimi after their collaboration on a horror streaming series. And Cronin did what good franchise filmmakers always do. He did not repeat what came before. He changed the geography. Evil Dead Rise moved the story from the woods to a condemned apartment building in Los Angeles. A single mother gets possessed. Her children have to survive her. It sounds straightforward, but the execution was something else. Cronin fused the pitch-black dread of the 2013 reboot with the outrageous gore of Evil Dead 2, and the result was a film that genuinely surprised people. Evil Dead Rise cost $19 million to make. It earned $146 million worldwide. That is not a successful film. That is a phenomenon. For reference, that return on investment beats most of what Marvel produces. Cronin later said in interviews that Raimi and Bruce Campbell gave him creative freedom specifically because they had been through enough genre cycles to trust instinct over formula. and that trust paid off enormously. So now we arrive at the problem, or the opportunity, depending on how you look at it. The director of Evil Dead Burn is Sebastien Vanicek. That name might not ring immediate bells unless you follow the international horror circuit, but among genre fans he has real credibility. His debut feature, Infested, released in 2023, was a French-language creature horror film about a spider infestation in a Paris apartment building. It was lean, claustrophobic, escalating, and genuinely frightening in a way that mainstream horror rarely bothers to be. Sam Raimi saw it and immediately wanted him for this project. The plot of Evil Dead Burn is built around grief and family, which fits the franchise's recent tendency toward more emotionally grounded premises beneath all the carnage. A woman loses her husband and travels to stay with her in-laws at their secluded family home. The Necronomicon turns up because it always does. Family members start becoming Deadites one by one. The tagline is literally, "Family is the root of all evil." The cast includes Sauhela Jacob from Dune Part 2, Hunter Doohan from Wednesday and Daredevil Born Again, Lucian Buchanan from The Night Agent, and Tandy Wright from Pearl. These are not obscure names. The casting signals serious studio confidence in this film. Vanicek has said publicly that his intention was, and I am quoting here, to create a visceral, sensory experience that punches the audience in the gut. He also made a reference at one point to wanting to do, in his words, a James Cameron move on aliens. That is a very specific and very ambitious comparison. Cameron took a horror franchise established by Ridley Scott and turned the sequel into an action film. Critics and audiences loved it. It is considered one of the greatest sequels ever made. Vanicek is apparently aiming for that category of franchise redefinition. The trailer dropped on May 5, 2026, and the trailer is genuinely different from anything the Evil Dead franchise has put out before. There's brutal fight choreography that belongs in a raid film. There's a car chase. There's a boat chase. Deadites are sprinting across rooftops. At one point, a Deadite runs straight up a bathroom ceiling, which is both terrifying and visually inventive in a way that feels completely in keeping with the franchise's love of creative spatial horror. But the trailer is not all action. There is a moment where a Deadite swallows a candle's hot wax while grinning, and it is the kind of image that burns into your memory the way only good horror can manage. There is a finger-severing scene that is going to make people watch through their hands. The gore and the scares are still very much present. Here is the part that requires some honesty. The action horror genre has one of the worst critical track records in cinema history. Cast your mind back to the early 2000s. That era produced an entire wave of action horror films. 13 Ghosts, Ghosts of Mars, Doom, the 2005 Dwayne Johnson film that earned $58 million on a $70 million budget, House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, Priest, Van Helsing, the Underworld series, the early Resident Evil films. What do all of these have in common? Critics hated almost all of them. Van Helsing is probably the definitive case study. Stephen Sommers directed it. Hugh Jackman starred in it. It had a $160 million budget, which was enormous for 2004. Universal put the full weight of its marketing machine behind it. They wanted it to launch a monster franchise. Pulled in about $300 million globally, which sounds impressive until you realize that number was considered a disappointment given the production and marketing spend. It holds a 24% on Rotten Tomatoes. The criticism leveled at Van Helsing was specific and consistent. Critics said the film was so obsessed with its action sequences that it forgot to build atmosphere or genuine dread. The CGI was overwhelming. The plot was incoherent. The monsters, despite being Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman, were somehow not scary. It was a film full of motion and noise that produced very little actual tension. And Van Helsing was not an exception, it was the rule. The core problem with most action horror films is structural. Horror depends on sustained dread. That dread comes from stillness, uncertainty, and a sense that the audience has no idea what is going to happen next. The moment you introduce large-scale action choreography and stunt sequences, you implicitly signal to the audience that the heroes are capable of fighting back. And once the audience believes the protagonists can fight back, fear becomes optional. The stakes become abstract. That is why the Doom film did not work. That is why Ghosts of Mars, despite being directed by John Carpenter of all people, failed critically. Once you see your protagonist loading weapons and preparing for a fight, you stop worrying about them in the way horror requires. So when Evil Dead Burn leans into this genre, it is not just making a creative choice. It is stepping onto ground that has swallowed significantly bigger films than itself. Except that is not the complete picture, because there are counterexamples and they are worth examining carefully. The 2004 Dawn of the Dead remake, directed by Zack Snyder, opened the film with the most chaotic, disorienting, relentlessly paced horror sequence of that entire decade. It was aggressive and kinetic from the first frame, and it worked. It pulled $102 million worldwide on a $28 million budget, and it holds a genuinely strong critical reputation to this day. Why did it work when so many others failed? Because Snyder never stopped treating the zombies as genuinely threatening. The action sequences in that film are terrifying precisely because the characters almost never feel in control. Running from zombies is different from fighting them. The film understood that distinction and committed to it. Wreck, the 2007 Spanish found-footage horror film, is another example. That film is relentlessly active. Characters are constantly running, fighting, and making desperate physical attempts to survive. It is practically an action film in its pacing, but the horror never dissipates because the protagonist never gains the upper hand. Movement and action in Wreck create panic, not power fantasy. From Dusk Till Dawn is probably the most radical example. Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino essentially made two completely different genre films stitched together. The first half is a crime thriller. Then at the midpoint, it becomes a vampire horror comedy action film. Critics did not unanimously love it at the time, but it has developed a devoted following specifically because of how committed both halves are to their own internal logic. What all of these films share is a willingness to keep the threat genuinely threatening even when the characters are fighting back. The action does not diffuse the horror, it amplifies the desperation. This is the line Evil Dead Burn needs to walk. Based on the trailer, it appears aware of that challenge. The Deadites in the footage are not lumbering and passive. They are fast, climbing walls, initiating car chases, actively hunting. The action is not heroes versus monsters. It looks more like desperate people trying to survive monsters that also happen to move fast. That is a critically different dynamic. There is something interesting about Vanicek's filmmaking background that is relevant here. Infested, his debut, is about a spider infestation that overruns an apartment building. Now that sounds like a premise for a silly B-movie, and Vanicek was clearly aware that people would approach it that way. What he actually made was a tense, kinetic, socially layered horror film that used the physical environment of the building as almost a character in itself. His spiders were genuinely disturbing, but the film also had action sequences, chase sequences, physical escapes through narrow corridors. Vanicek already knows how to make threat feel urgent even when characters are moving and fighting back. He has done it before at a smaller scale. Evil Dead Burn is essentially asking him to operate that same instinct at franchise scale, with significantly more budget and a globally recognized IP. The other thing worth noting is that this film was shot in New Zealand, which has become something of a proving ground for technically demanding genre films. The physical production apparently ran from late July 2025 through mid-October 2025. The fact that the film was shot, edited, screened at CinemaCon in April 2026, and is now getting wide release in July 2026 suggests a high level of confidence somewhere in the production chain. Studios do not aggressively market films they are nervous about. And then there is the Sam Raimi factor. Raimi is not a passive producer on this franchise. He has been actively involved in selecting every director who has touched Evil Dead since the 2013 reboot. He picked Fede Alvarez, he picked Lee Cronin, he picked Vanicek. His judgment on this specific franchise has been validated 3 consecutive times. Evil Dead Burn is not arriving in a vacuum. There is a broader shift happening in how studios are approaching horror. Zach Cregger, who directed the genuinely terrifying Barbarian, has been announced as the director of the upcoming Resident Evil reboot. And that reboot's screenplay is being co-written by Shay Hatton, who wrote John Wick Chapter 3 and Army of the Dead. That is a deliberate fusion of action and horror pedigree in one project. The fact that 2 major horror franchise reboots in 2026 are independently converging on the action horror genre suggests this is not a coincidence. There are people in studios who believe the genre is ready for rehabilitation. After years of elevated psychological horror and prestige scary films, there appears to be a market appetite for horror that moves faster, hits harder, and makes you physically tense in a different way. Whether that instinct is correct remains to be seen, but if both Evil Dead Burn and the Resident Evil reboot land well with critics and audiences, the action horror subgenre could be entering a genuine revival, and that would be a fascinating development for horror as a whole. There is already another Evil Dead film confirmed. Evil Dead Wrath, written and directed by Francis Gallopy, began principal photography in February 2026 in Auckland. It is currently scheduled for April 2028. Bruce Campbell has said publicly that the franchise is now operating on a 2 to 3 year release cycle, and that Sam Raimi is working with his brother Ivan Raimi to create a kind of connective tissue for the universe going forward. The Book of the Dead is apparently the through line that will link these stories across different settings and directors. So this is no longer a franchise that releases a film every decade when someone has a good idea. This is a franchise with a plan. Evil Dead Burn is not a one-off experiment. It is a building block. That raises the stakes for what Vanicek is attempting. If his action horror gamble pays off, it legitimizes an entirely new direction for the series. If it does not land, the franchise still has Wrath in the pipeline, and enough creative goodwill built up over the last decade to survive one misfire. Either way, the Evil Dead franchise is in a more structurally interesting position than it has been at any point since Raimi's original trilogy. Here is what I genuinely believe about Evil Dead Burn. The trailer is not trying to hide what the film is. It is showing you car chases and rooftop fights and Deadites moving at speeds that defy physics. But it is also showing you the candle wax, the severed finger, the grinning possessed face. It is telling you that the horror has not been traded in for the action. It has been loaded into the action. That is the only version of this genre shift that has ever worked historically. Dawn of the Dead worked because the horror was inside the momentum. Wreck worked because speed and terror were the same thing. If Vanicek has managed that balance, Evil Dead Burn could be the film that rehabilitates an entire subgenre. If he has not, then it joins a long list of visually ambitious horror action films that critics quietly set on fire. We find out July 10, 2026. The Evil Dead franchise has died and come back before. Multiple times, with chainsaws, it tends to come back angry.